Hello, I'm Todd Phillips, the editor of Canadian Auto Dealer. We're here today with Darrell Bricker. He's the CEO of IPSOS Public Affairs. Darrell's a well-known Canadian author, pollster, public speaker, and a commentator, and he's going to be taking the stage at the CADA Summit on February 12th. Darrell, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Todd. I'm really looking forward to being at this.
Well, we're really looking forward to having you because you have not only ideas, you have data between the polling work you do and just sort of demographic data. You can help our dealers understand kind of what their future might look like. And they're always keen to hear because they're trying to sort that out for their markets. What does that look like? And you have a unique lens. So maybe share a few of the findings you might be presenting with our dealers at the summit.
Great. I'm happy to do that. The big thing I think that we're going to be talking about is what I would like to call context. And it's not specifically necessarily about what's going to happen tomorrow in the automobile market or the mobility market or whatever you want to call it, like what the sales are going to be next week, but what the overall context of what's going on in Canada looks like, because that's going to determine what the sales are going to be for over a period of time and what the consumer needs are going to be over a period of time. And I would say that the big theme of the presentation I'm going to give to the dealers is the Canada that you think you know probably isn't the Canada that we are, and that really comes down to demographic change, which I'm going to lean heavily on in our conversation at the summit. And the big things to know from that are that, first of all, we're a lot older than I think we are. I think that we're more multicultural than we used to be, but also, and this is a part that people tend to really miss, almost all of the growth that's taken place in the Canadian population over the space of the last couple of generations has been in car commuting suburbs. In fact, we're not, even though we're more urbanized, we're not urbanized in a downtown sense, we're more urbanized in a suburban sense. Along with that, what we're also seeing is that we're having, even though we're living in suburban places where usually people raise large numbers of kids, that's actually not what's happening. In fact, the fertility rate in Canada has collapsed. And if we didn't have the level of immigration that we're currently experiencing, the Canadian population is actually going to begin to shrink. And in fact, over the next 2 years, as they roll back on immigration, we're going to start seeing the Canadian population shrink. So a few things like that that really talk about what's happening in the population sets up what you should be able to expect in terms of the mobility market, whether it's automobiles or whether it's other types of mobility devices that people will be using.
Well, one of the key things that you hit on there with sort of, an aging population and sort of the next generation is affordability. So in terms of on the economic scenario, cars are getting more expensive, certainly since after COVID, the supply ended up favoring the higher cost of vehicles. So it's become a big issue for the industry. What do you see in terms of the makeup of our population in terms of their economic power going forward? Because that's obviously a huge concern for dealers, whether that's, the ability of the younger generation to afford it or maybe, on the immigration side, maybe new arrivals being able to afford maybe at the levels dealers are used to seeing.
Well, if you are someone who is in the baby boom generation, you're actually feeling pretty good. And why wouldn't you be? You got all the nice houses, you had all the good jobs, and you probably have a pension of some sort. And you certainly did well in the stock market if you invested at all. So that group's feeling reasonably good about the future. The next group, though, the millennial generation and the Gen X generation, are not feeling great at all. In fact, they're the people who are driving a lot of the desire for political change that we're seeing right now. So these are people who are at the stage of their life where they feel that they should have achieved certain middle class markers on the way through, like, for example, owning their own home, and they feel that that has been denied them, and they're feeling a lot of anxiety and anger about that situation, followed by their kids, who are Generation Z, and they're feeling like none of the things that we aspire to as members of the middle class are going to be available to them at all. And they're actually quite angry, along with their parents, about the current situation in Canada. They're feeling like they're under a lot of pressure financially. They're feeling like their day-to-day bills are harder and harder to pay. Whether that's true or not is another conversation, but that's, in this game, perception is reality. That's how they're personally feeling. So we've got one group of the population that's feeling reasonably good. That's the older part of the population. And then you have the kind of middle-aged middle class, aspirational middle class that's not feeling great. And then we have their kids who are really kicking off and not feeling like things are ever going to be available to them. That does not set up well for our financial future.
And I guess this crosses in. You mentioned that they're angry and they're mobilizing, and if we could just have a lens on the political landscape a little bit, how that impacts maybe the overall market trends. Obviously, in the automotive space, there's things like pressure for regulation on limiting gas powered vehicles, that sort of stuff. So sometimes some of those forces of change will impact the business landscape to a certain extent. What do you see shaping up in Canada in terms of what our political future might look like in the near to longer term? Notwithstanding rather an announcement that's probably gonna come out today regarding the prime minister's future. We'll leave that alone for now. But overall, what do you see, so some of those forces? Because that does impact the business climate to a big extent.
Well, the prime minister, it's interesting. You can look at him as a unique Canadian situation, but actually, he's part of a long line of progressive leaders who are being punished in the political system at the moment. So, if you take a look at 2024, it was the biggest year of elections in human history. And almost everywhere, the incumbent government was either defeated or the margin by which they won shrunk. To the extent that there was change, people moved to more conservative type options. In some instances, very nationalist, non-progressive options. So they distinctly moved to the right. So that's what's happening worldwide. It's also something that we're starting to see happen in Canada and is likely to happen as we move into in through 2025. So what does that mean for things like, for example, the environment? Well, back in 2019, the environment was a really big issue in the Canadian national election. It was a big issue in Canada. In fact, Canada, when you ask people about climate change, for example, that was right near the top of the list of public concerns. Climate change is now somewhere around 10 on the list of things that people care about, both globally and also in Canada. And we're much more focused on things that relate to um, uh, the cost of living, housing, and even things like immigration. So what's happened is people have stopped thinking about the effects of whatever they're doing happening on the bigger world, and they're starting to think more specifically about what's happening in their own personal lives, the specific which is their families. So their sense of the world has gotten a lot smaller, and they become more focused on things that are much shorter term. So as a result of that, going all in, for example, on anything that relates to the climate is a bit of a difficult sell right now. We're seeing it in the United States, for example. We're probably going to see it in Canada with the emergencies or whatever our next government is going to be, unless all the polling is completely wrong. And it's certainly something that we're seeing in many, many, many countries in the developed world, where people are kind of pushing back on something that seemed so certain a while ago. So my sense is that there's going to be a lot of challenges on anything that has to do with climate and the environment over the next while. People are not prepared to pay the price.
Well, listen, Ed, we could talk all day. I've got a tons of follow-up questions, but I don't want to steal all your thunder, because the goal is really to just do a bit of a teaser look ahead and make sure people attend the summit and hear a more in-depth presentation, which I'm looking forward to as well. So I appreciate your time this morning for that.
Thanks a lot, Todd.